be the foundation for understanding the rest of the book, specifically regarding Hosea.
The things he had to do, his wife, and then all the other things he had to do concerning that.
So who did he marry? Gomer, and what was significant about her, or would be, I guess? Play the harlot. So it's likely that she was not a harlot. There's a lot of very important parallels to draw to that from that. For example, it would seem that their marriage is a microcosm of the nation in more ways than one. For example, not only does it represent how Jehovah feels as he's being betrayed, and then the strength of his love to forgive and bring them back, as Hosea would take Gomer back in chapter 3, that's alluded to. But also think about, there was a question about, was she a harlot already or was she not? And I think that more likely she wasn't. And we talked about that because Israel didn't start off in idolatry, did they? It didn't take long for them to get there. But the text we'll look at even in this section speaks about in verse 10 of chapter 9 how Jehovah found them with great potential, that they would bear fruit for him. And then shortly after that, they turned away from him and committed adultery. And so that's what happened with Gomer. And why would Gomer, a true historical figure, this is not just, merely figurative language. Hosea is a person. Gomer is a person he married. She actually committed adultery against him. So Gomer, why do you think she would turn to harlotry? Think about the historical context of Israel at this time. Why would an Israelite be led into that?
Because the spiritual leadership wasn't there.
Spiritual leadership wasn't there, okay? And so, like the priests, they are rejected because they've rejected knowledge. They weren't teaching the people. And who had Israel turn to? The Baals, right? And what was very characteristic of idol worship, especially that of the Baals? Sexual immorality, harlotry, prostitution, in the name of worship. And so it seems you have this corruption in Israel with idolatry, and Gomer is one of those Israelites that is affected by that. And her morality degrades to the point of harlotry. And so that's kind of what happens with Israel. It was apostasy is kind of a gradual thing. It got worse and worse and worse until God eventually said, I've had enough, but then even in his mercy, he'd bring them back. So there's a lot of parallels to draw with that. So you have that fact in chapter 1 of Hosea marrying Gomer, and they have some children, and you don't have to remember their exact names, but what did the names represent if they're literally translated? God would have no what toward them anymore? Mercy. And it's because ultimately they were what to God? They weren't God's people. And so those, and in chapter 2, when he brings a charge against his wife, which would be Gomer, or in the respect to what we're thinking about, Israel to Jehovah, brings a charge against her, and he talks about the wife and then the children. You've got the nation and then the children, and you've got all of these things that are brought against her, and there's going to be judgment. And then in chapter 3, Hosea would take Gomer back, and that would allude to the time when God would take the remnant back from captivity under the Messianic time, right, Scott?
Yeah, it was just such a mirror image, of the Israelites and Hosea and his wife and so on. And it was like, I always think of it as they would like say, why would you do that? And he could be like, well, God made me do it. Why are you doing the same thing? You know what I mean? It's just such a, and if they could foresee what was going on, they could, realize that they're failing.
Yeah, and you can imagine, how this would enhance the message as Hosea proclaimed it to the people when he has personally felt what God feels, although God's is on even a different level than that. So, that's certainly, you see God's wisdom in that. Did y'all get my PowerPoint, by the way? I sent a PowerPoint to the 84th Street email. You can pull that up if you want to try to. So, you have them take it back. So then in chapter 4, what we see starting is, the charge is brought against Hosea or against Israel. That's a legal term, charge. And now details start coming out, right? So what are the kind of things that are pointed out in the section Nevin covered that Israel is guilty of? What's the climate like in Israel during this time? I know Baal worship and that spiritual infidelity in regard to them turning to other gods, but what surrounded all that? What was a part of all that? Thank you.
Lack of knowledge.
Okay, they lack knowledge. Now, did they lack knowledge of their history or who their God was or what his character traits were? So think about it on a practical level, and you see that throughout the New Testament too, and it was expected of Israel. It's not just intellectual grasping of concepts and theories, and that technically Jehovah is just. Technically Jehovah is merciful. Technically Jehovah is one God. So don't go after other gods. It's more than just knowing those things. It's them becoming a part of your life, right? And so, you have frequently a problem in denominationalism, Catholicism, other religions, but we even fall prey to it in the church, is this exchange of information and this kind of interaction in that way, and that amounts to salvation. And that's not how the knowledge that leads to salvation works. It's a matter of a knowledge that becomes a part of your life. And so it's not just passing the test or uttering these words. It's a practical, profound knowledge of activity. In fact, notice in chapter 6 and verse 6, when he says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings, think about that idea of mercy and not sacrifice. It's faithfulness or loyalty, but also involved in that would be compassion for your fellow man, mercy towards your fellow man. But we studied, Psalms and Proverbs, so we've talked about, not long ago, Hebrew parallelism. You're going to see a lot of that in this language in the prophets. So mercy is paralleled with knowledge of God, and sacrifice, of course, burnt offerings. So when he says, I desire mercy, and then he says the knowledge of God, you combine those two and realize that knowledge of God means relationship with God, not just knowing things about him, but being involved in that kind of relationship with him, fellowship, joint participation. So if God forgives, we should forgive. If God stands for truth, we stand for truth. If God stands for justice, we stand for justice. If God delivers the oppressed, we deliver the oppressed. And it's not just knowing that that's technically how he acted, and I know that, but it's actually being involved in it. It's about activity. So lack of knowledge. What else?
He says that they were lying and killing and stealing.
Yeah, so and who are they lying to and killing and stealing from? Themselves. This is how degraded their morality is. Studying the history that's leading up to this, as you saw in the introduction, he gave kind of the chapters from Kings and Chronicles that we could study to see what was going on. There's assassinations, and there's revolts, there's conspiracies, all of these kinds of things. People are killing each other, and it's awful. It's awful. And you'll kind of see that. I forget which minor prophet it is, but you remember Jesus when he was speaking about the call to discipleship, and he talks about a daughter-in-law will be against her mother-in-law and a father-in-law. Well, that was spoken of by Jesus as, if you follow me, there may be a rift in your family. But he's alluding to, at least using and borrowing the language of the minor prophets, that are speaking about how among the children of Israel, with no good reason, people were at each other's throats. They were against each other. They were betraying each other. And there wasn't anything noble about it, like us following the truth, and our parents don't, so there's going to be a rift in that relationship. There was just sin that was doing this. So horrible, horrible things they were doing to each other. Nevin, did you have something else? So you had also some political problems that were involved in this, and what were they? How did they view a serious threat? What did they do? They trusted in Baal. Was there any men they trusted in? Other nations. Egypt is mentioned. Assyria themselves, right? So what do you do when a bully's trying to bully you? Well, you try to make friends with the bully. That doesn't often work out that way because their character is not to be trusted. And that's what they did. So throughout Israelite history, that was pretty typical. You rebel against God. God disciplines you to try to get you to realize you need Him. And instead of realizing that, you start trusting in other nations. And then the people that you trust in actually turn against you. And in fact, their loyalty, their truthfulness, their faithfulness was not just marred in the relationship with Jehovah, but just period. They were not reliable people, Israel wasn't. And so when they make an alliance, were they true in that alliance? Or did they often betray the people they tried to make an alliance with? And that's kind of what happened with Assyria. And so there's just so much, they're shooting themselves in the foot over and over and over again. And so you see these things play out. Moral, political, and religious sins. They corrupt the nation. And their harlotry, then they will be judged. Anything else before getting into chapter 9? I know there's a lot. Okay, chapter 9, we have the title for this section as God's judgment and punishment of Israel's sins. So again, he is just elaborating on the things that they have been guilty of. And just with more and more language, it really gives us the depth of the problem, and I believe helps us relate it to ourselves. The more it's not just about, okay, Hosea is about adultery, spiritually, unfaithfulness, political revolt, pretty bad times, and that's it. Well, when we study the details, and Hosea, God through him, explains on a further and deeper level just what was going on here and relates it to us in powerful language, it helps us better appreciate what's going on and I think reflect on ourselves. So let's read about their apostasy and then the punishment that they would receive in verses 1 and 2. Someone go ahead and read verses 1 and 2. I won't ask someone to read every time, but let's just start that off that way. Hosea 9, 1 and 2, please.
Do not rejoice, O Israel, with joy like other peoples. You have played the harlot against your God. You have made love for hire on every threshing floor. The threshing floor and the winepress shall not feed them, and the new wine shall fail in her.
All right, thank you. Back in Bo's class in chapter 2, you've got the prosperity of Israel. They've got wine, they've got grain, everything's good, and they're rejoicing, aren't they? Who do they attribute that success to? Not quite. There's pride in there, certainly. But ultimately, these are a theistic people, a religious people, if you will. And who do they attribute that success to? Who are their lovers? Baal, right? And so, Bo did a good job of explaining the occult of Baal in regard to it being a chief god, the storm god, but also what else? Fertility, right? With storms comes rain and fertility. So all that kind of stuff. And so if our crops are doing well, if we've got wine, gallons of it, upon gallons of it, then the fertility god must be the reason for that. If our nation the population is growing, we're flourishing, there's not many that are struggling with being barren or whatever, we attribute that to the fertility god, right? And so they are attributing their successes to Baal, and they're rejoicing about it. Now, if you think about Romans 2, when the Apostle Paul speaks about the goodness of God and his long-suffering and forbearance is meant for your repentance, that kind of plays right into this. It's not a denial of their success, but when God sends rain, when God gives provisions, is it to make them think someone else is giving it to them? Or even as Carl said, I'm doing it for myself? Or is it to get them to wake up and realize, hey, God's watching over me. God's providing for me. He's being faithful to me like he said he would. And so I'm going to stop doing this and be loyal to him because he's not changed toward me. He's being good to me. But that's not what they did they? So he tells them, stop rejoicing. What's interesting to me is he says, like other peoples. So when Baal worshipers have times of prosperity, then they show their gratitude toward Baal, don't they? And they rejoice. And so not only, though, is he saying don't rejoice like them, but what does he say? You have played the harlot against your God. When they do that, they're being loyal to their God. They're not turning to Jehovah and thanking him for the rain. They're thanking Baal for the rain. That's their God. And that's what's really interesting to me, is that they're faithful to their God. They're wrong. He's false. But they're faithful to their God. But Israel's not. Don't rejoice like them. That they rejoice in their fidelity. You rejoice in your infidelity and receive wages as a harlot. And so he says, listen, all of this isn't going to prosper for you. It'll not feed you. It'll fail. Don't trust in this. This is making you ripe. Amos would talk about a vision of a basket of summer fruit, and they're ripe for destruction. I mean, things are great. You better watch out. You better watch out. Anything on that? But
I can't remember if I talked about it in one of my classes, but going through chapter 2, prosperity and misattributing it, going back to Joshua, everybody is pretty familiar with Joshua 15, and maybe even verse 14 of chapter 24. But what's interesting is, leading up to that, and particularly verse 13, this is God talking through Joshua. It says, I have given you a land for which you did not labor, and cities which you did not build, and you dwell in them. You eat of the vineyards and olive groves which you did not plant. And then it goes into, put away the gods that your father served on the other side of the river. It's indeed will you, in my house will serve the Lord. And so all of that is, I am giving this to you. Put away those other gods and recognize and give credit where credit is due.
yeah,
It's kind of that saying of hard times produces hard or tough people. Soft times, or
Yeah.
easy times, soft people.
right.
And they kind of get comfortable, I guess.
That's a good point. And preceding this in the book of Judges, that's the cycle you see, right? You see times of prosperity, and that leads to unfaithfulness, then that leads to captivity, and then that leads to trusting in God and him delivering them, and then it goes just all the way over again. So great point. This rejoicing he tells them not to do is not because rejoicing is bad, but the rejoicing is not in the Lord. And so notice what he goes on to say in verse 3, they shall not dwell in the Lord's land, but Ephraim shall return to Egypt and shall eat unclean things in Assyria. What is Egypt representative of? Bondage, right? So their bondage is going to be Assyrian, but Egypt stands for bondage. You're going to go back. You were delivered from oppression and bondage. That's where you're going to return. That's in Assyria. And what you're eating is going to be unclean because it's in the land of unclean Gentiles. But notice, as the rejoicing in verse 1 is condemned, it's condemned because it's not in the Lord. It should be in the Lord, though, because he's the one who blessed you. But now you're not going to even have that as an option. Verse 4, they shall not offer wine offerings to the Lord, nor shall their sacrifices be pleasing to him. It shall be like bread of mourners to them. All who eat it shall be defiled, for their bread shall be for their own life. It shall not come into the house of the Lord. What will you do in the appointed day and in the day of the feast of the Lord? For indeed they are gone because of destruction. Egypt shall gather them up. Memphis shall bury them. Nettles shall possess their valuables of silver, and thorns shall be in their tents. So when they were prospering, they did not use that to commune with the Lord. So think about that with the collection. We prosper, and what do we put at the top of our budget, or should we? I mean, it's kind of the heart of the contribution is you should prioritize this, giving back to the Lord. And what does that indicate? That above all other things, the thing with the most importance in my heart, as it reflects my money that I've been blessed with by God, is His will. I want His will to be furthered. And so I'm going to earmark this for God, and I'm going to give up my means as I purpose in my heart. That was the first fruits for Israel, wasn't it? God blesses us. What's the first? What does it go to? It's the best, and it goes to God. God gets it first. And you commune with God in that way. They were to tithe, but was that all they gave? No, they gave way more than just 10%. And the feast days reflected that. The things that they were involved in worship to God that involved their livelihood and all their possessions, it showed communion with God. But when they prospered here, they used it for themselves, and they communed with Baal. And he's saying, now you're not even going to have the option to commune with God, because we're not in fellowship anymore. You're in captivity. In verse 6, he's explaining that all that wealth, Egypt and Memphis, which is a chief city of Egypt, will just swallow it up and replace it with thorns. And it represents all of that being squandered with the bondage that they would be disciplined with. So important things to think about. What we have should cause us to reflect on the goodness of God. And in that reflection, our faithfulness should show toward Him, rather than attribute it to my own ability or to someone else, and therefore fail to commune with God.
Question, the bread of mourners, what do you know what that was?
Yeah, so in Jeremiah chapter 16 verse 7, it alludes to the bread in mourning to comfort them for the dead. We know what that's talking about in the South, don't we? I think we're pretty good about that in this congregation. When someone goes through a tough time, especially a loss, they get some meals. But while that might cheer us and that's meant for good intentions, that might not taste as good as it would if everything was okay. And so that's kind of the idea. Instead of bread that should be for rejoicing, verse 1, but with Jehovah, since you rejoiced with Baal, you rejoiced in your idolatry, it's going to be food in captivity that only reminds you of a death of a relationship. You ultimately, you died, your relationship died with the Lord. And he'd allude to that later on, that it's dead. Good question. I kind of skipped over that. So, verse 7, he continues that the days of punishment have come, the days of recompense have come. Israel knows the prophet is a fool, the spiritual man is insane, because of the greatness of your iniquity and great enmity. The watchman of Ephraim is with my God, but the prophet is a fowler's snare in all of his ways. Enmity in the house of his God, they are deeply corrupted. As in the days of Gibeah, he will remember their iniquity, he will punish their sins. There's some difficulty with the language here. Apparently, I don't know Hebrew, but that's what I'm told. So there might be some differences in your translations, and we'll try to work through that a little bit. But our first question has to do with verse 7. How are the prophets and spiritual men viewed by those who are rebelling against God? Jason?
Crazy or lunatics.
Yeah.
Or unhinged.
That's often what you see. You're crazy. In fact, Jeremiah said, I'm in derision daily. Everyone mocks me. I speak of violence and plunder, but they mock me because of it. There's another way of viewing this, that the false prophets are foolish, and the false spiritual men, unspiritual men, are insane. So the counsel they're giving is ridiculous. You shouldn't trust in it. But I think that it's likely the view of the people toward what Hosea is saying and other prophets are saying. They've just completely ignored it. And why would they hear a message like that and think that person is insane or a fool?
That's not what they want to hear.
It's not what they want to hear. He says their greatness of their iniquity and their great enmity. They are opposed to God, so his message is going to sound crazy to them.
Also, I mean, that their lives were going well at that time.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
it would
exactly.
sound crazy.
Yeah, great point. Everything's going great. What are you talking about? You know, we see that in the New Testament too. 2 Peter 3. You know, things continue as they were from the very beginning. What are you talking about? Judgment from the Lord. It'll come as a thief in the night. Scott.
I always think of where the verse that says calling evil good and good evil. And that just carries throughout the world and history.
Absolutely.
And you can make good evil. I mean, in the sight of crazy.
Yeah, I mean, you think about who they were attributing all this prosperity to, Baal. Hey, we've been serving Baal and things have been going great, you know. But what they don't realize is that that is God blessing them in spite of their unfaithfulness, to get them to realize He's here and He wants to have that relationship with them. You're scratching yourself on it. Okay. So verse 8, I think there's some variation to it. I like the ESV, and it makes sense to me. The ESV says that the prophet is the watchman of Ephraim with my God, yet a fowler snare is in all of his ways, and hatred in the house of his God. It seems that the prophet, as Ezekiel is sent as a prophet and called a watchman, the prophet, joined that with verse 7 is saying, listen, watch out. Assyria is going to get us if we don't turn back to God. And they're saying, you're insane for saying that. And so what they do is they lay a snare for him. They lay a trap for him. They hurt the prophets. They murder the prophets. They definitely rebel against the prophet's words, even though they're trying to deliver them from the punishment that is to come. Verse 9 mentions Gibeah, and that is our second rather... I thought it was in here. Yeah, number 5, because it's also in chapter 10, verse 9. To what do the days of Gibeah refer? And what went on there? Punishment?
Yeah. Benjamin.
Okay, I thought you said punishment. Yeah, Benjamin. Benjamin was almost completely wiped out, right? Some pretty sick things happened there. Jason, did you have something to add to that?
Just more detail. I kind of went down that rabbit hole on that one, but
Sure.
yeah, basically.
Yeah, so horrible, horrible things. A Levite visiting with a concubine, and some men wanted to know him carnally, and they said, the owner of the house said, here's a virgin daughter, so, I mean, that wasn't good either. But also his concubine, and they sexually abused his concubine all night long, and because of that, judgment came against Benjamin, and the tribe was almost completely wiped out. And he's saying, listen, that's how I view you. That's how bad things are. And it's been that way for a long time.
And they did nothing.
Yeah.
They just stood there and like,
Right.
what's happening, like we're doing here.
Yes. And so there's pretty graphic memories that would come up with that. And he's going to punish them for it. Again, he mentions that in chapter 10 too. Scott?
I know this is off subject, but it's on that subject. What do you think the emphasis of when Israel lost so many men at first, and then finally the third time, the first 2 times they went out, the Benjaminites or whatever killed like 25 or 30,000 of them.
Yeah.
And then the third time, God said, this is it. You're going to get them this. What do you think that signifies?
I don't have an answer for that. I imagine that the wisdom of God behind that has a reason for it. First thing that might come to mind is sin is so bad. I mean, and that would definitely show it. I mean, but I don't have an answer for that. It's a good question, though. I need to read up on it.
I would just say, I saw a commentator that said this as the idea that as a society without God descends into violence, immorality, and self-destruction.
Absolutely.
And that's what you see in Judges there.
Sounds familiar to me, too, now, right? Recently, with a group of guys, I think it was, but, I think we need to remember, while America's not a Christian nation, okay, any more than any other nation is, God doesn't have a nation, okay? It's good that we were built on some pretty good principles found in the Bible, but we shouldn't forget that we're not some special nation to God necessarily, and we're pretty young. But God still rules in the kingdoms of men. So I can't put my finger on why COVID happened. It could have been a judgment of God in some way, globally, certainly our country. What goes on in all nations, God has a hand in some of it. Providentially He's working. And studying the prophets should help us reflect on that. So he's not talking about America or Russia or any other kind of thing like that. With premillennialists go down that, false rabbit hole and all. But we do need to reflect on it in that way too. God still rules in the kingdoms of men, and righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Jason?
That account of what happened in Gibeah is pretty rough. And when you read that, if you look at that from the perspective of, well, this was acceptable to God, how they offered up the women and this happened. It's the wickedness and the lawlessness of men. And I think that it speaks to the authenticity of Scripture that we read these things that are laid out with all the ugliness
Yeah, exactly.
that went on. Whereas if you were trying to write something in a way where it was positively reflecting, everything,
Yeah.
it would be completely different than the way that it's recorded.
That's a good point. And, I haven't read a lot of the apocryphal books and stuff, but I've recently been reading a book that refers to some of them, and it's amazing how those writers often try to, they either completely ignore the bad in the Old Testament, or they shape it in a way that makes it not as bad. Like there was some form of justice in that on Israel's part, that they didn't really do that bad. There was a reason for it, or and it's crazy because God doesn't do that. He says, listen, my people are awful right now, and they're going to be judged for it. So good point. So how God found Israel and what they became. Ultimately, he sees them and like grapes in the wilderness, as the first fruits on the fig tree. So they have potential. That he has a plan to make them bear fruit. It seems to me that if grapes are in the wilderness and God's going to take them, he's going to prune them, he's going to cultivate them, and they're going to bear even more fruit. Isaiah 5, there's the vision or the symbol of Israel as a vineyard, and God has, he put them on a choice hill, he tilled everything, he put a wine press in it, he built a tower in it, he did all this stuff so that they could bear tons of fruit, and they bore bad fruit. And he says, what did I do wrong? Why'd you bear bad fruit? And they have potential. And why'd they bear bad fruit? Because they immediately turned to idolatry. Alluding to Numbers 25 with their interaction with the Moabites, where they committed sexual immorality, and there was a plague, and a lot of people died. And because of that, they become an abomination like the thing they love, verse 10 says. So what they should have done is when God calls them out of Egypt and they agree to that covenant, God transforms them to be his representatives on earth and give light to the rest of the nations. But what they did is they became like the rest of the nations. And so when you serve God, truly, you'll become more like God. You won't become God, but you'll be like Jesus. That's what we talk about all the time. Christ is formed in us. But when you serve false gods, you take on their characteristics and their behaviors, and that's what happens. So he says that their glory will fly away like a bird. You're not going to be fruitful anymore. And even the children that you might have, they're going to die, and you're going to grieve over them, and you're going to deliver them to a murderer, so Assyria, because you're unfaithful. You're just kind of having children to make them go into captivity. It seems the prophet in verse 14 is like, God, what are you going to do for them? And he says, I'll give them a miscarrying womb and dry breasts. They're not going to get anything good from me. They had their chance. Verse 15, he mentions Gilgal. A lot of times he mentions these places, and there's historical context to them, and a lot of times it's bad. Gilgal is good context, but he says there's wickedness in Gilgal. They turned a place of blessing into idolatry, and now they're dried up, and they're going to be cast away, verse 17, because of their failure to obey the Lord. So he speaks more about their sins and their coming captivity. So in chapter 9, we see some details, but it's kind of more generic, isn't it? Now in chapter 10, he kind of lists out some specific things that they're guilty of. For example, in verses 1 through 3, it speaks about his fruit being brought forth for himself. So So he kind of alluded to that before. But their prosperity is not being used to turn to God and praise Him and thank Him, but it's being used for themselves to feed their own fleshly desires. And he increases his altars, and his sacred pillars are embellished. So he is, again, turning to Baal and serving him. And it says in verse 2 that their heart is divided. That's one of the questions. What's a divided heart indicate?
No loyalty.
No loyalty. Like you're saying you're with me, but then you're saying you're with them. That doesn't work out here. James 4 says that the Spirit who dwells in us yearns jealously. Haven't you read that before? This is kind of one of those places. God doesn't want a divided heart. So he's going to break down their idolatry in verse 2. And they say, we have no king because we did not fear the Lord in verse 3. And as for a king, what would he do for us? And so they're kings that they trust in. They're impotent. They can't help you. And so really what you see here, and this is borrowed outline. I didn't come up with this, but puppet kings and puppet gods. So idolatry, that's puppet gods. I'm going to make a god to benefit myself. And with these kings, originally, and we see it in the language in the rest of the book, they requested a king from God in rebellion, and he gave them one. And he's going to take it away in his wrath. But their kings are puppets too. God was supposed to be their king. They said, we want to be like the other nations. And it's for their benefit ultimately. It's very selfish. But when push comes to shove, and you turn to your king, is he going to help you? No. He's nowhere. So a puppet king might be good for the times it's good, but it's awful when you actually need a king that will save you and deliver you. Verse 4 kind of indicates furthermore how and why they're going to perish. And this should be a warning for us, because he's been talking about outer forces coming and punishing them. But notice in verse 4 he says, they have spoken words, swearing falsely and making covenant. Thus judgment springs up like hemlock in the furrows of the field. In Deuteronomy 29, that's where you have this warning of any root of bitterness springing up, and by this many become defiled. This idea of springing up is in the midst of Israel themselves. So Paul warns the Ephesian elders that savage wolves will come from among you. And so this is kind of an implosion. This is kind of an inside-out type of a destruction. They're destroying themselves. And it's because they're untrue to the covenant they made with God. And then even when they turn to other nations, as we talked about before, they're not loyal to God, they're going to be loyal to them? No. And that's going to come back to bite them. And so it springs up like poison in their own fields, and they die from their own deeds. And, that should, warn us. Our sin will find us out.
And hemlock's a poison anyways. It's a poison
Exactly.
plant.
Right. And that's that kind of root of bitterness. You're not faithful to God, and it's going to come back to get you by itself. And so verses 5 and 6 talk about that idol you trust in. Now you're mourning for it because it's taken away to Assyria. Verse 2, God said that I will break it all down. I'll break down the altars and the sacred pillars. And that idol you were trusting in so much, you're going to be mourning for it. Where is it now to save you? And your king will be cut off. He mentions the high places of Aven, that is Beth Aven, as it's mentioned several times, are going to be destroyed. It's going to be so bad that you're going to yell to the mountains to fall on you. And that's language Jesus used with the destruction of Jerusalem. It's language that Revelation uses in chapter 6 of that book for the destruction of those people who would dare withstand God. They have sinned from the days of Gibeah again, and they will be overtaken. Notice in verse 11, he says, Ephraim is a trained heifer that loves to thresh grain, but I harnessed her fair neck. I will make Ephraim pull a plow. Judah shall plow. Jacob shall break his clods. When you remember what Paul alludes to this in 1 Corinthians 9. You shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. So what does that mean? When an ox is treading out the grain, what does he get to do? He gets to eat. So when we work for God, is sometimes that hard work? Sure. But we benefit from it, don't we? An ox likes to tread out the grain because it gets to eat. He says, you didn't see the blessing in that. And now I'm going to take that away from you and put on a yoke that's hard to bear, and you're going to plow the fields. That's not so fun, is it? And that would certainly be the discipline of captivity. So he calls them to repentance because of their unfaithfulness. So I won't give an introduction next time, and we'll get through the book. So we'll pick up there in Hosea 10 and 11, Lord willing, on Sunday.